Adriana Barsetti had already dismissed Brigitte Bardot before ever looking at her directly. She presented the costume to the room, to the producer, to the crew, to the seamstresses, as if the decision had already been made. The garment stood at the center under the lights, complete, measured, finished. Bardot stood near the door with nothing, no position, no role, no acknowledgement. Everyone in the room understood what that meant. The role had been decided. The fitting was no longer a test, it was a confirmation. But what happened next in that room forced every single person to reconsider what they thought they were seeing. The fitting room of Cinecittà's costume department had been arranged to communicate a specific operational logic. 20 crew members, 2 assistant directors, 4 seamstresses, and the film's Italian producer occupied its perimeter in positions that suggested familiarity with the work, each person placed in relation to their task, each task running on a schedule that had not been interrupted by the morning's arrival. Bardot stood without a designated position in any of this, off to one side near the door, in her own clothing, with no surface in front of her, and no clear role in the room's current organization. The space between her and the dress form at the center was not large. It was simply unclaimed. Barsetti had not looked at her directly since the assessment began. She worked her hands along the costume's constructed lines as she spoke, demonstrating the garment's standards through contact rather than description, her fingers moving to the shoulder seam, then the side construction, then the front panel. Each movement precise and unhurried in the manner of a person who has made this case before and has not needed to raise her voice to make it land. A seamstress carried a bolt of fabric past Bardot without slowing. The bolt held at chest height, her eyes on the cutting table at the far wall. Another seamstress was already kneeling at the dress form's hem, placing pins at intervals along the lower edge with the focused attention of someone performing a task that had a clear and agreed-upon endpoint. The room's motion was its own argument, and it was a complete one. Nothing in the space had paused to acknowledge that the morning's central question was still open. The producer's arms remained crossed, his weight settled back on his heels, his gaze tracking Barsetti's hands along the garment, with the expression of a man watching a demonstration he had already understood. The dress form held the room's center position under the lamp. Bardot held nothing, no position, no surface, no object, and the room had not moved to change that. If you're interested in untold stories from cinema's golden age, subscribe now. This is a fictionalized dramatization inspired by real public figures and historical settings. It does not depict a documented event. By 1963, Brigitte Bardot had accumulated a body of work that critics in France and abroad had spent years discussing without examining. Her name appeared in cultural arguments as evidence rather than subject, cited to support conclusions that had been reached before her films were watched, used to illustrate positions that did not require her actual performance choices as material. The question of whether she could carry a serious dramatic role had been answered in most of the rooms that answered such questions before it was formally asked, and the answer had been in circulation long enough that it had stopped requiring justification. She had arrived in Rome on the basis of a preliminary casting conversation, the kind of conversation that constitutes an opening rather than a commitment, an expression of possibility that both parties understand to be conditional on everything that comes next. What came next was a fitting session at Cinecittà with Adriana Barsetti, and what that meant in practical terms was a morning in which the standards of the production would be made visible, and the distance between those standards and Bardot's credentials would be measured in a room full of witnesses. The conversation that had brought her here had not mentioned that the measurement had already been taken. The Italian film industry held its own hierarchy, and Cinecittà sat near its upper register. A production mounted there with a full costume department running, a senior designer assigned, and a fitting schedule underway represented a specific kind of institutional investment that did not announce its conclusions in advance because it did not need to. Barsetti's credit list went back 30 years across 3 decades of Italian production, and her opinion, delivered in a fitting room, carried the accumulated weight of a professional record that predated Bardot's entire public career. Her presence in this room was itself a signal that the production considered the question serious. Her behavior in this room was a signal that she considered it already resolved. The film had been positioned publicly as a serious dramatic production, the kind of vehicle that required its lead to be evaluated on criteria that went beyond the photographic. The director had spoken in interviews about the demands of the period silhouette, about the construction requirements of mid-century Italian tailoring, about the particular relationship between garment and body that the role required. These observations had appeared in print in the weeks before the casting process was concluded. Everyone in the fitting room had read them, and the reading had settled into the room's shared understanding of what the morning was for. The costume on the dress form had been constructed to a specific standard, and the construction was visible from any position in the room. It was not a preliminary version, not a muslin, not a draft. The fabric had been selected, cut, fitted, and finished to a completed state, the seams pressed, the panels aligned, the hem prepared for final adjustment. It existed as a completed argument about what the role required, and it had been placed at the room's center before Bardot arrived, which meant the argument had been made before she had been given the opportunity to enter it. The room's physical arrangement had established its position before Barsetti said a word. The dress form at the center, directly under the overhead lamp, Bardot at the margin, near the door, in the room's least organized space. The distance between them was the first visible fact of the morning, and it had been established by the room's arrangement rather than by anything either woman had done since arriving. Barsetti moved to the front of the dress form and addressed the producer by name, a deliberate choice, the use of the name establishing the relevant audience for what she was about to demonstrate. Her assessment was precise and unhurried. She spoke about proportion in the context of constructed period silhouettes, about the specific relationship between shoulder width and bodice cut that the garment had been built to express, about the difference, and here she paused briefly, her hand settling on the costume's front panel, between a body that translates well in a photographic frame and a body that supports the structural demands of serious theatrical tailoring. She did not raise her voice. She did not look at Bardot. She did not need to do either of these things for the room to understand what she was describing. The producer uncrossed and recrossed his arms. He was watching the costume, specifically watching Barsetti's hands on the garment, with the focused attention of a man tracking a demonstration he had requested and was finding confirmed. His eyes moved along the lines Barsetti's hands indicated, following the argument as it traveled across the garment's surface. His attention had not moved to Bardot since the assessment began, and its continued absence from her direction was a form of communication that required no translation. The seamstress at the hem finished placing the last of her pins and sat back on her heels to assess the line. She adjusted one pin, removed it, shifted it a fraction of an inch, replaced it, then adjusted a second in the same deliberate manner. Each correction confirmed that the hem was being prepared for a body whose measurements were already known and were not the measurements of the woman standing near the door. The adjustments were not exploratory, they were finishing work. A second seamstress arrived from the workroom through the side door, carrying 2 additional lengths of cut fabric folded over her forearm. She crossed the room without hesitation, set the fabric on the cutting table beside Barsetti's working materials, and turned back without making eye contact with anyone. The materials had been cut to specifications determined before the session began, and they had been brought in on schedule because the session was running according to its original plan. 2 assistant directors stood near the back wall. One of them made a notation on a clipboard, a brief downward movement of the pen, a small administrative mark, without changing his expression or shifting his posture. The notation carried no urgency and communicated no uncertainty. It was the movement of a person recording the status of a proceeding that is running on schedule. Barsetti stepped back from the dress form and turned to present the producer with a full view of the garment from the front, an open-handed gesture toward the costume that invited his assessment of what she had been demonstrating. The garment hung as it had been built to hang, the shoulder construction holding its line, the side panels maintaining their fall, the front panel smooth from neckline to waist. The dress form beneath it gave the costume the shape of an occupant without the complication of an actual person, and in this it served the demonstration perfectly. The costume was not waiting to learn which woman it belonged to. Bardot had not moved from her position near the door since the session began. Her hands were at her sides, the stillness of a person who has decided not to perform neutrality and is instead simply standing in it. She was watching Barsetti's hands move along the costume's surface, watching the producer's eyes track the demonstration, watching the seamstress complete finishing adjustments on a hem that incorporated none of her measurements. The room had built its case through motion, through the continuous, organized, purposeful movement of people who knew what they were doing, and the case was nearly complete. The second assistant director said something to the first, in a lowered voice. The first responded with a single nod, unhurried, and returned his attention to the clipboard. It was a small exchange, and a revealing one. The communication of people engaged in shared work, moving toward a conclusion they had both already accepted. Barsetti returned to the back of the dress form and reached for the rear seam, the last section of the garment she had not yet demonstrated. Her hands moved with the same precision she had applied to every other part of the costume, reading the construction with her fingers the way a person reads a text they have written themselves. The room had given no indication of impatience with the length of the demonstration, and Barsetti had given no indication she was aware the session had an audience beyond the producer. The producer's gaze moved from the costume to Bardot, a brief, direct look, the first from anyone in a position of significant authority in the room since the session began. It lasted less than 2 seconds and contained no invitation, no pause, no softening of the morning's established dynamic. It was the look of a man checking a variable he had not recently assessed, finding it unchanged, and returning his attention to the more active part of the room. The session was moving toward its end, and the end had been arranged before it began. Bardot moved, she stepped away from the door and crossed the room in a direct line toward the dress form, her stride unhesitating and her direction unambiguous from the first step. The room did not stop immediately. The seamstress at the hem was still in position, Barsetti's hands were still on the rear seam, but the movement was visible to everyone in it, and it registered as something other than the normal repositioning of a person within a shared working space. She reached the dress form and took the costume from it with both hands, lifting it from the shoulders in a single clean motion, her fingers closing on the fabric at the shoulder seams, the garment releasing from the form as she raised it, the dress form's surface clearing beneath her hands as the costume came free. She turned with it toward the fitting mirror mounted on the far wall, crossed the remaining distance without breaking stride, and held the costume against the front of her own body, her hands at the garment's shoulders, the fabric resting against her chest, the hem falling to the floor along her legs. She faced the mirror showed her face, the costume held against her, and behind both of them, the entire room. The dress form stood empty at the center of the fitting room, its padded shoulders bare under the overhead lamp, the surface that had held the standard against which the morning's entire argument had been conducted, now cleared of the argument. The lamp continued to illuminate it. The light fell on nothing. Barsetti's hands were still positioned on the rear seam. They had not completed the movement they were making when Bardot crossed the room, and they had not begun a new one. She was looking at the mirror. Her hands remained at the level of the empty form's back, in contact with nothing, the gesture suspended at the point where the object of the gesture had been removed. The room went quiet in the way a working room goes quiet when the work it was organizing stops without warning, not the quiet of a scheduled pause, but the quiet produced when the continuous small sounds of active labor cease simultaneously. The pinning stopped. The clipboard went still. The fabric on the cutting table was not touched. The sounds that had constituted the session's working atmosphere, fabric movement, pin placement, the soft percussion of the clipboard's notations were absent, and the absence was louder than any of them had been individually. All eyes turned to the mirror, to Bardot's hands at the costume's shoulders, to the garment's constructed lines falling against her body in the glass, to the reflection that contained her and behind her the full arrangement of the room, the producer at the center, Barsetti, to the right of the empty form, every face oriented toward the glass. The seamstress, who had been kneeling at the hem, had risen to her feet without completing her final pin adjustment and was standing with the pincushion in her hand, looking at the mirror. No one moved. The producer had shifted his weight forward. His right foot advanced a half step and stopped there, the step begun but not completed, his body held in the posture of a person who had started towards something and had not decided whether to continue. The assistant director's pen was held above the clipboard at the angle of a notation prepared but not executed. Barsetti's hands had come down from the rear seam and rested at her sides with the particular stillness of hands that have lost their reference point. Barsetti looked at the empty form, her eyes on the bare padded shoulders, on the lamp that continued to illuminate a surface that no longer held the garment she had been demonstrating. Then she looked at the mirror. Then she looked at the producer. Her hands remained at her sides, without motion, without destination. 5 seconds passed. The producer completed his step. He moved to the center of the room, to the position the dress form occupied, the space directly under the overhead lamp, and stopped there. He did not go to Barsetti. He did not go to the mirror. He stood at the room's center and looked at the reflection in the glass, and his arms, which had been folded across his chest for the entire session, had come apart and hung at his sides. 10 seconds passed. Barsetti moved to the side of the room, not toward the mirror, not toward the door, but laterally, along the wall, to a position she had not occupied at any point in the session. She reached the side wall and stopped, her back near the production board, her face turned toward the center of the room. She was no longer beside the dress form. She was no longer beside anything. She did not speak. The seamstress, who had been working at the hem, turned the pincushion over in her hand. A small, aimless rotation, the object moving without purpose. The fabric bolt, delivered from the workroom, remained on the cutting table untouched, the cut lengths still folded. Nothing in the room had returned to the motion that had characterized the session's first 20 minutes. 15 seconds passed. Bardot remained at the mirror. Her hands were still positioned at the costume's shoulders, the garment still held against her body, the reflection unchanged. Behind her in the glass, the producer stood at the room's center where the dress form had been, and the dress form stood to his left, empty, still receiving the lamp's light. The form was the most formally illuminated object in the room. It was now the least relevant one. The fitting room had been a space of organized and purposeful motion from the moment the session began. Each person with a task, each task contributing to an outcome the room's arrangement had defined in advance. That motion had stopped when the costume left the form, and nothing had resumed. The crew remained along the walls. The seamstresses remained in the positions the turning moment had caught them in. The clipboard had not produced another notation. The producer turned his head to look at Barsetti directly, his face finding hers across the room's width. The look was not aggressive and not conciliatory. It was the look of a man who needed to take a new reading of the room's authority and was beginning the process by identifying where in the room that authority now resided. Barsetti received the look from her position against the wall and did not return it immediately. She was still facing the mirror. The fitting room was still. The overhead lamp continued to illuminate the center of the space, the empty dress form, the cleared surface, the padded shoulders that had supported the costume for the duration of the morning's assessment. In the mirror, the room remained visible behind Bardot in full, the producer at the center, Barsetti along the wall, the crew at the perimeter, the seamstresses standing rather than kneeling, the cutting table with its untouched materials. Every person was still in the room. Every person was looking at the glass. The room that had organized itself around a concluded argument was still standing in the same physical arrangement. It was no longer standing in the same certainty.